My boss fired me on Friday. 3 months later, he asked me for a job.
My boss didn't yell. He didn't have to. The entire office heard him anyway. 40 people stopped typing. Phones went silent. Even the printer in the corner seemed to pause for a second. I looked up from my laptop and saw Brandon Hayes standing beside my desk with his hands in his pockets. He was smiling. Not the friendly kind of smile. The kind people wear when they're enjoying someone else's bad day. He slid an empty cardboard box across my desk. 5 minutes, he said. After that, security will escort you out. Nobody looked at me. Not because they didn't care, because they were afraid. Afraid that if they made eye contact, they'd be next. I slowly closed my laptop. For 5 years, I'd been the first person to arrive every morning, sometimes before sunrise. I'd skipped birthdays, canceled vacations, worked weekends without complaining. And now, everything I owned at work fit inside a cardboard box. As I packed a framed picture of my parents, Brandon leaned closer. "You know what your problem is, Michael?" I didn't answer. "You think you're smarter than everyone else." He tapped the side of my monitor. "Here's a free lesson. In the real world, loyal employees are replaceable." Then he walked away laughing. Nobody said a word. Not my coworkers. Not human resources. Not even the 2 security guards waiting by the elevator. One of them quietly held the door open for me. He looked embarrassed. I'm sorry, man." I forced a smile. "It's not your fault." Outside, the cold February wind hit my face. For the first time in years, I had nowhere to be. If you'd asked me that morning whether I thought I'd still have a job by lunchtime, I would have laughed. The truth is, I loved working there. Not because of Brandon. Nobody liked Brandon. People tolerated him because his last name was on the building. Northridge Industrial Solutions had been founded almost 40 years earlier by his father, Richard Hayes. Richard had built the company from a tiny warehouse into one of the largest suppliers of construction equipment in Ohio. Everyone respected Richard. He knew employees by name. He shook hands on the factory floor. He remembered birthdays. Then, he retired. Brandon took over. Everything changed. Within 6 months, the free coffee disappeared. Employee bonuses were cut. Experienced managers quit. People stopped smiling in the hallways. Instead of asking, "What do you need?" Brandon's favorite question became, "Who's responsible?" Every meeting felt like an interrogation. Every mistake needed someone to blame. Every success somehow became his achievement. I wasn't special. I was just one of many people trying to survive under bad leadership. But unlike most employees, my job allowed me to see numbers. And numbers don't lie. I worked as a senior financial analyst. Every purchase, every contract, every supplier payment. Eventually, it landed on my desk. For months, something had been bothering me. Sales reports looked healthy, but cash flow kept getting worse. Inventory was piling up in warehouses. Shipping costs were climbing. Longtime customers were quietly choosing competitors. At first, I assumed I was missing something. So I checked everything again. Then, again. Then, one more time. The conclusion never changed. We were spending money much faster than we were earning it. And if nothing changed, the company had less than a year before serious financial trouble. I prepared a detailed report, 38 pages, charts, forecasts, recommendations. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was just facts. I emailed it to Brandon. 23 minutes later, I received a reply. 3 words. Stay in your lane. That was it. No questions, no meeting, nothing. I should have realized then that telling the truth was becoming dangerous. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. Brandon approved expensive office renovations. He leased luxury SUVs for executives. He hired expensive consultants who spent more time making PowerPoint presentations than solving problems. Meanwhile, the production department kept asking for replacement equipment. Requests were denied. Warehouse managers asked for additional staff. Denied. The IT department warned that several servers were reaching the end of their lifespan. Denied. But somehow, there was always enough money for executive retreats. One afternoon, my friend Ethan dropped into my office. He managed logistics. He closed the door before speaking. "You've seen the numbers, haven't you?" I nodded. He didn't need to explain. "You think we're in trouble too?" I looked around to make sure nobody was nearby. Then I lowered my voice. "Worse than people realize." He let out a slow breath. I knew it. The shipping department hasn't been paid on time in 2 months. That caught my attention. What? They're telling vendors the accounting system is delayed. It isn't. They just don't have enough cash. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Because once you understand a business, you can usually tell the difference between a temporary problem and the beginning of a disaster. This didn't feel temporary. It felt like the first crack in a dam. And once a dam starts cracking, it rarely stops. The following Monday, everyone received an email. Mandatory company-wide meeting. Attendance required. Brandon loved meetings, especially when he was the one talking. The conference room filled quickly. Nearly every department manager was there. Brandon walked in 10 minutes late, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a cup of expensive coffee. He didn't greet anyone. He simply connected his laptop to the projector. The company logo appeared on the screen. Then, a giant headline. "The best year in company history?" I frowned. That couldn't be right. Not based on the reports I'd seen. Brandon began speaking with complete confidence. "Our future has never looked brighter. Revenue is up, growth is accelerating, and we're about to sign the biggest contract this company has ever seen." Applause echoed through the room. Some people clapped because they believed him. Others, because they knew not clapping would be noticed. Then he looked directly at me, smiled, and said something that would change my life forever. "Michael, since you're our numbers guy, why don't you tell everyone what you think?" Wanted an audience, not a discussion. 40 pairs of eyes shifted toward me. Some looked curious. Others looked nervous. Ethan, sitting 2 seats away, slowly shook his head. "Don't do it." I understood exactly what he meant. Smile, agree, sit down. That was the safe option. But there was one problem. I wasn't very good at pretending everything was fine. Brandon leaned against the conference table. "Well, you've been awfully quiet lately." The room was completely silent. I stood up. If you're asking whether the company has strong revenue, it does. Brandon smiled confidently. See? I told you. I raised one finger. But revenue isn't the same thing as profit. His smile faded slightly. I continued. Our operating expenses have increased almost 30% in the last 12 months. A few department managers exchanged quick glances. Most of them hadn't seen those numbers. Our inventory levels are the highest they've been in 6 years. I could hear someone stop typing on a laptop. And our available cash has been decreasing every month. Brandon interrupted me. Cash flow fluctuates.
It does, but not like this. I walked toward the projector. I actually prepared a report. I plugged my laptop into the screen. The slide changed. No flashy graphics, just numbers. Simple, clear, impossible to misunderstand. The room became even quieter. One chart showed expenses climbing. Another showed available cash dropping. A third projected what would happen if spending continued at the current pace. 16 months. That was all. 16 months before the company would likely need emergency financing. Nobody said a word. Even Brandon stared at the screen. Then, he laughed. Not because anything was funny, because he realized everyone else had just seen what I'd been trying to tell him for weeks. He turned back toward the room. Ladies and gentlemen, this, he pointed at my presentation, is exactly why accountants shouldn't run businesses. A few nervous laughs echoed through the room. Not because people agreed, because nobody wanted to be the only one not laughing. Brandon walked over and unplugged my laptop from the projector. The company logo returned to the screen. You know what separates leaders from analysts? He didn't wait for an answer. Vision. People like Michael only see problems. Leaders see opportunities. More forced applause. He looked straight at me. I just signed a contract worth $18 million. The room erupted into genuine applause this time. 18 million. It was barely breaking even, and that was before unexpected costs. One delay, one increase in material prices, one missed shipment, the company would lose millions. I took a slow breath. Did anyone calculate the actual fulfillment cost? Brandon's expression hardened. I don't believe I asked for another presentation. No, you asked for my opinion. A few people looked down at the table. They knew where this was heading. The contract is underpriced, I said calmly. If raw material costs increase by even 8%, the company loses money on every shipment. Silence. One of the operations managers slowly raised his hand. Is that true? Brandon answered before I could. No, it's overly conservative. I looked at him. I used your own purchasing numbers. He stepped closer, close enough that only the first row could hear him clearly. You really enjoy embarrassing yourself. I stayed quiet. He turned back toward everyone. This meeting is over. People immediately stood up. Nobody wanted to be the last person in the room. As chairs scraped across the floor, Ethan walked past me. Without looking in my direction, he whispered, "You should have stayed home today." Maybe he was right.
Around 4 that afternoon, my phone rang. Human resources. Michael? Could you come to conference room B? I didn't need them to explain. After 5 years, I already knew. Conference room B wasn't used for interviews. It was used for exits. When I opened the door, Brandon was already sitting inside. So was Melissa from HR. A single folder rested on the table. My employee file. Melissa avoided eye contact. She looked like she hadn't slept. Brandon leaned back.
Melissa quietly slid a document toward me. Position eliminated. I almost smiled. My position wasn't eliminated. I'd seen the hiring requests. They were already interviewing my replacement. This isn't about restructuring. Brandon shrugged. Believe whatever helps you sleep. Melissa finally spoke. You'll receive 8 weeks of severance. Better than nothing. I signed the paperwork. Not because I agreed, because arguing wouldn't change anything. As I stood to leave, Brandon called after me. You know what your biggest mistake was? I turned around. You thought being right was enough. He smiled. In business, being useful matters a lot more. I nodded once. Maybe. Then I walked out. At the time, I thought that conversation would be the last time.
And the caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in almost a year. Daniel Carter, my uncle, the managing partner at Carter and Whitmore Capital. I answered. Hey, Uncle Dan. His voice was unusually serious. I heard what happened. I frowned. How? Ethan called me. Of course he did. There was a brief pause. Then Uncle Dan asked a question that would change everything. Michael, how much do you know about Northridge's real financial condition? I looked back at the office building through my apartment window. The company logo reflected in the evening sun. For the first time, I realized this story wasn't over. It had only just begun. And the caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in almost a year. Daniel Carter, my uncle, the managing partner at Carter and Whitmore Capital. I answered. Hey, Uncle Dan. His voice was unusually serious. I heard what happened. I frowned. How? Ethan called me. Of course he did. There was a brief pause. Then Uncle Dan asked a question that would change everything. Michael, how much do you know about Northridge's real financial condition? I looked back at the office building through my apartment window. The company logo reflected in the evening sun. For the first time, I realized this story wasn't over. It had only just begun. I hadn't spoken to my uncle in almost a year. Not because we'd argued. Life had simply gotten busy. He traveled constantly. I worked 60-hour weeks. We'd exchange birthday texts, maybe a Christmas phone call. That was about it. So hearing his voice the day after I got fired felt strange. Are you home? He asked. Yeah. I'm 20 minutes away. Before I could answer, he hung up. Exactly 23 minutes later, a dark gray Audi pulled into my apartment complex. Daniel Carter stepped out, wearing jeans, a black jacket, and the same calm expression he'd had for as long as I could remember. Most people imagined investment fund partners as loud, flashy millionaires. That wasn't my uncle. He hated expensive watches, never talked about money, still drove himself everywhere. The only thing that gave away his success was how carefully he listened before speaking. He walked into my apartment, looked around, and smiled. So, you finally got weekends back? I laughed for the first time in 2 days. I guess I do. He placed 2 coffees on the kitchen counter, then became serious. I need you to answer one question.
I nodded. How bad is Northridge? Not, how are you? Not, what happened? Just one question. How bad is it? I took a slow breath. Worse than people think. He didn't interrupt. I think they're burning cash. They're hiding supplier delays. They're overpaying for inventory. And I hesitated. And I think Brandon is making decisions just to make quarterly reports look better. Daniel slowly nodded. As I expected. I frowned. What do you mean? He pulled a thin folder from his bag.
Companies only start calling private investment firms when banks stop feeling comfortable. Daniel opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, financial statements, loan summaries, and one page with the Northridge logo stamped across the top. They violated 2 loan covenants. I stared at him. They what? They're technically in default. I felt my stomach tighten. Nobody inside the company knew that. At least, nobody below Brandon. Daniel took another sip of coffee. The bank hasn't called the loan.
Our fund isn't interested in buying healthy companies. We buy companies that can still be saved. I knew what that meant. Carter and Whitmore didn't destroy businesses. They rebuilt them. My uncle had spent 25 years rescuing manufacturers that were one bad decision away from bankruptcy. Sometimes they replaced management. Sometimes they sold divisions. Sometimes they invested millions. But they only did one thing after weeks of investigation. They gathered facts. We're beginning due diligence next week, Daniel said. And I want you on the team. I looked at him in disbelief. You can't be serious. I've never worked for the fund. You've spent 5 years inside Northridge. You know the people, the suppliers, the accounting system, the contracts. No outside consultant can replace that. I looked out the window. Yesterday, I was unemployed. Someone wanted me to investigate the company that had just thrown me out. It almost sounded ridiculous. What if Brandon refuses? Daniel smiled. He won't have a choice. His bank already agreed. Monday morning, instead of waking up worried about finding a new job, I walked into Carter and Whitmore Capital. Not as an employee, as an outside consultant. The office couldn't have been more different from Northridge. Nobody wore expensive suits unless they wanted to. Nobody shouted. Nobody pretended to be important. People simply worked. Daniel introduced me to the team. This is Michael. He spent 5 years inside Northridge. I want everyone listening when he talks. There was no applause, no awkward introductions, just nods, respect. It felt different. By lunchtime,
We had transformed one conference room into what they called a data room. One wall showed supplier relationships. Another tracked bank debt. A third listed every major customer. The deeper we looked, the worse everything became. One analyst frowned at his screen. These inventory numbers don't match. Another looked over. They're impossible. I walked over. What is it? He pointed at 2 reports. The warehouse says they have $12 million of inventory. The balance sheet says 18. $6 million missing.
Or overstated. Neither possibility was good. Then another analyst spoke. I think I've found something. Everyone turned. There are at least 4 consulting contracts, paid to companies that don't appear to have employees. Daniel slowly stood up. How much? Just over $2.4 million. Nobody spoke. or overstated.
Neither possibility was good. Then another analyst spoke. I think I found something. Everyone turned. There are at least 4 consulting contracts paid to companies that don't appear to have employees. Daniel slowly stood up. How much? Just over 2.4 million. Nobody spoke. The room suddenly felt smaller. I looked at the company names. None of them sounded familiar. Then, one address caught my eye. I knew that building. I'd driven past it dozens of times. It wasn't an office. It was a mailbox rental store. A UPS store. I felt a chill run through me. Those aren't real consulting firms. Daniel looked at me. You sure? I'm positive. The room went completely silent. If millions of dollars had been paid to companies that didn't really exist, this wasn't just bad management anymore. This was something much bigger. Daniel closed the folder in front of him, then calmly said the sentence that changed the direction of our investigation. Nobody tells Northridge we're looking at this. Not yet.
Nobody left the conference room, not even for coffee. The atmosphere had changed completely. An hour earlier, we were analyzing a struggling manufacturing company. Now, we were looking at something that could end careers. Daniel uncapped a marker and walked to the whiteboard. Let's slow down. We don't know if this is fraud. We don't know if it's incompetence. And we definitely don't accuse anyone until we have proof. Everyone
Jump to conclusions. Facts first, opinions later.
Sarah, one of the senior investigators, projected the payment history onto the large screen. There are 4 consulting companies: Blue Summit Advisors, Harbor Strategic, Midwest Operations Group, and Silver Oak Solutions. Each had received payments over the previous 18 months. Small amounts at first. $20,000, $30,000, $50,000. Then suddenly, the payments exploded. $200,000, $300,000, $500,000.
Always approved by the executive office. Never questioned.
I leaned closer to the monitor. Something felt familiar. Not the company names, the approval codes. Northridge required 2 executive signatures for any payment over $100,000. Every transaction had the same authorization. Brandon Hayes and I frowned. Sarah noticed. You know her? I nodded slowly. Chief Financial Officer. Daniel looked surprised. The CFO signed every payment? Apparently. That didn't make sense. Linda had worked for Northridge for almost 20 years. She had started under Richard Hayes. She was respected by everyone. Quiet, careful, almost painfully cautious. She was the last person I'd expect to approve suspicious transactions. Daniel crossed his arms. Interesting. By Wednesday afternoon, we had built a timeline covering almost 2 years. Patterns started appearing. Every time one of those consulting companies received a large payment, Northridge postponed paying suppliers. Every time executive bonuses increased, maintenance budgets were reduced. Every time Brandon announced record growth, another loan was quietly taken out. It was like watching someone use a credit card to pay another credit card. It looked stable. Until suddenly, it wasn't. Sarah pointed at another spreadsheet. Michael.
You worked with purchasing. Did Brandon ever explain why supplier contracts kept changing? I immediately remembered. Every few months, we switched vendors.
sometimes to companies nobody had heard of. The explanation was always the same. They're cheaper. Except, they usually weren't. I slowly looked back at the screen. Oh no. What? I think I know what he was doing. Everyone turned toward me. If you constantly replace suppliers, you create new contracts. So nobody notices when payment structures change. Sarah's eyes widened. Because everyone assumes it's part of the new agreement. Exactly. The room fell silent.
Late Thursday afternoon, Daniel's assistant walked in carrying a thick envelope. It just arrived from First National Bank. Daniel opened it immediately. Inside was a confidential credit review prepared by the bank 6 weeks earlier. He skimmed the first page, then stopped, read it again, then handed it to me without saying a word. Halfway down the page, one sentence caught my attention. Continuation of current executive management represents a material lending risk. I looked up. The bank actually wrote this? Daniel nodded.
They've already lost confidence. Another page listed concerns: declining liquidity, unexplained consulting expenses, inventory discrepancies, customer losses, weak internal controls. Everything we'd been finding, the bank had already noticed. But there was something else. Something much more alarming. At the bottom of the report, a recommendation. If management cannot present a credible recovery plan within 90 days, pursue restructuring or sale. I looked at Daniel. 90 days? He checked his watch.
Today is day 78. The room suddenly became very quiet. That meant Brandon had less than 2 weeks, not to save the company, to convince the bank it could still be saved. Otherwise, the bank would force drastic action.
Friday morning, Daniel received a phone call. He listened for almost 5 minutes without interrupting. When he finally hung up, he smiled for the first time all week.
Good news?
He looked around the room. Depends who you ask.
The board of directors has called an emergency meeting.
When? Monday morning. Sarah leaned forward.
They know? They know enough. What about Brandon? Daniel shrugged. He probably thinks it's another quarterly review. I remembered every board meeting I'd attended. Brandon always walked in like he already knew the outcome. Confident. Relaxed.
Certain that nobody would challenge him. This Monday would be different. Very different. That evening, I drove past North Ridge for the first time since being fired. The parking lot was almost empty. Only a few lights remained on inside the building. For 5 years, that place had been my second home. I'd celebrated promotions there, made friends there, worked late nights there. Now I sat across the street, watching strangers leave the building. My phone buzzed. It was Ethan. You busy? I called him. What's up? His voice was barely above a whisper. Something weird is happening. What do you mean? Brandon had IT disable access for 3 accounting employees. I frowned. Why? No idea. And Ethan hesitated. I saw shredding bins being wheeled into the executive offices. I sat up straight. How many? 6. Every instinct I had screamed the same thing. People don't start shredding years of paperwork on a random Friday night.
They're afraid of what someone might find. I looked back at the illuminated executive floor. One office was still lit. Brandon's. I had a feeling he wasn't working late to save the company. He was trying to save himself.
I barely slept that weekend. Not because I missed my old job. That feeling disappeared the moment Brandon handed me the cardboard box. What kept me awake was the timing. The emergency board meeting, the shredded documents, the bank's 90-day deadline. It all felt connected. Sunday evening, my phone rang. Daniel. Tomorrow, 8:30, wear a suit. I frowned. I thought the board meeting was private. It is. So why am I coming? There was a brief silence. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. Because if they start asking detailed questions, you're the only person who can answer them.
Monday morning. Northridge looked exactly the same. Same parking lot, same entrance, same glass doors. 3 days earlier, security had escorted me out through those doors like I was a criminal. Now, the receptionist stood up the moment Daniel walked in.
"Good morning, Mr. Carter." She looked at me. Recognition flashed across her face. Michael. She seemed genuinely surprised. I know. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone thought I'd disappeared. Daniel placed a visitor badge on the counter. "We're here for the board meeting." The receptionist nodded immediately. "The conference room on the 4th floor." As we walked toward the elevator, I noticed something strange. People were staring. Not because I was important, because nobody expected to see me back inside the building. Certainly not walking beside an investment partner.
The 4th floor conference room was unlike any meeting room I'd ever seen. Dark walnut table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Columbus, leather chairs, coffee already waiting. 7 members of the board were quietly talking among themselves. Most were in their 60s. Several had worked with Richard Hayes since the company was founded. Then, the door opened again. Brandon walked in. Perfect suit, perfect smile, perfect confidence. Until he saw me. He stopped walking. Just for a fraction of a second. But I noticed. His expression changed. Confusion. Then annoyance. Then something closer to concern. What is he doing here? He wasn't asking anyone in particular. Daniel answered calmly. "Mr. Carter is assisting our due diligence." Brandon laughed. "You brought a disgruntled former employee?" Daniel didn't react. "We brought someone familiar with the company's financial systems." One of the board members, an older man named Charles Whitman, looked toward Brandon. "Take your seat." Brandon's smile disappeared.
The meeting began exactly at 9. Charles adjusted his glasses. The purpose of today's meeting is to review concerns raised by First National Bank. Brandon immediately interrupted. With all due respect, there are no serious concerns. Daniel quietly slid a thick folder across the table. There are. Silence. Charles opened the folder. Inside, copies of everything. Inventory discrepancies, consulting payments, cash flow reports, supplier delays, loan violations. Nobody spoke for nearly 2 minutes. The only sound was paper turning. Finally, Charles looked at Brandon. "Are these documents accurate?" Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. "You've been busy." I met his eyes.
I kept copies of every report I wrote. His jaw tightened. One board member leaned forward. I have a question. He tapped one page. What exactly is Silver Oak Solutions? Brandon answered instantly. Operational consultants. Another director asked, what services did they provide? They advised executive management. Can we see the reports? Brandon hesitated. I don't have them with me. Charles looked annoyed. You spent over $1 million without keeping reports? I said I don't have them here. Daniel finally spoke. We tried contacting Silver Oak. And there are no employees. The room became completely silent. We visited the registered office. It doesn't exist. Another board member slowly lowered his glasses. What? It's a mailbox rental. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for coffee. Brandon looked around the table. This is ridiculous. You're making assumptions. Daniel calmly placed another document in front of Charles. The payments. All approved by executive management. Brandon glanced at the paperwork. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked nervous. Then, something happened that surprised everyone. The conference room door opened. Linda Morrison walked inside. The CFO. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Charles frowned. Linda, we weren't expecting you. She looked directly at the board. I requested to speak. Nobody objected. She placed a flash drive on the table. I've worked here 21 years. My loyalty has always been to this company. She took a deep breath. And that's exactly why I'm here. Brandon slowly stood up. Linda, I think you've said enough. She ignored him. The consulting companies? I warned Brandon not to approve those payments. Every head in the room turned toward Brandon. He told me, if I refused to sign, I'd lose my job. The silence felt almost heavy. Linda continued. I made copies of everything. She pointed at the flash drive. Emails, wire transfers, internal approvals, meeting notes. I've already provided identical copies to the bank. Brandon's face turned pale. You recorded private communications? I documented executive decisions. Charles slowly leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then he looked at Brandon and quietly asked, Is there anything you'd like to tell this board? Brandon opened his mouth, closed it again. He looked around the room, searching. There wasn't any. Not anymore. He was alone. And for the first time in years, everyone in the room knew it. Nobody moved, not even Brandon. Linda's flash drive sat in the middle of the conference table like it weighed 100 pounds. Charles Whitman finally broke the silence. Linda, can you verify that everything on this drive came from company systems? She nodded. I made copies over several months. I was afraid they'd eventually disappear. Brandon slammed both hands onto the table. This is insane. She's a disgruntled employee. Linda looked at him for the first time since entering the room. I still work here. Brandon froze. For years, he'd controlled every conversation simply by speaking louder than everyone else. Today, nobody was listening.
Daniel connected the flash drive to the conference room computer. Thousands of files appeared. Emails, invoices, internal approvals, meeting notes, wire confirmations. Sarah opened the first folder. The room filled with the clicking of a mouse. Nobody spoke. Then, an email appeared on the projector. From Brandon Hayes to Linda Morrison. Don't send this through purchasing. Use Silver Oak instead. Nobody checks consulting expenses. The room became deathly quiet. Charles slowly removed his glasses. When was this sent? Sarah checked. 18 months ago. Another email. Delay payment to Midwest Steel until next quarter. We need cash for executive bonuses. Another. Richard doesn't need to know yet. I looked toward Brandon. His face had gone completely pale. For the first time, he looked scared. One of the board members quietly asked, "Who's Richard?" Nobody answered. They didn't have to. Everyone knew. Richard Hayes, the founder, Brandon's father. Although officially retired, he still owned nearly 60% of the company. Charles frowned. I thought Richard reviewed all executive spending. Linda shook her head. He stopped coming into the office after his heart surgery. Brandon told him everything was under control. Daniel folded his arms. So the majority owner has no idea what's happening? Linda slowly replied, I don't think he knows half of it. Another board member leaned forward. Can we call Richard? Brandon answered immediately. No. Every head turned. My father is recovering. He doesn't need this stress. Charles looked at him for several long seconds. I wasn't asking your permission. He reached for his phone. Brandon stood up. I said no. Nobody reacted. Charles calmly dialed the number anyway. The room was silent. After the third ring, someone answered. Richard? It's Charles. We need you here. There was a pause. No, it can't wait. Another pause. Then Charles quietly said, Your company is in serious trouble. He listened for a moment. Finally, we'll see you in an hour. He hung up. Brandon looked furious. You had no right! Charles met his eyes. I've known your father longer than you've been alive. The sentence landed like a punch. For the first time, Brandon realized he wasn't the most powerful person in the room.
An hour later, the conference room door opened. Richard Hayes walked in, using a cane. He looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned completely white, but his eyes were exactly the same. Sharp, observant. The entire room stood. Everyone except Brandon. Richard slowly sat at the end of the table. He looked around. Someone want to tell me why I canceled a cardiology appointment for this? Nobody spoke. Charles quietly slid the folder across the table. Start with page 1. Richard read in complete silence. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. Nobody interrupted him. Eventually, he reached Linda's emails. Then the consulting payments. Then the inventory reports. Finally, he closed the folder. Without looking up, he asked one question. Brandon,
"Did you read these reports?" His son answered confidently. "Some of them are misleading." Richard repeated the question, slower this time. "Did you read them?" Brandon hesitated.
Not all of them. Richard nodded once, then turned toward me. Michael. I wasn't expecting him to remember my name. Sir? Were these your reports? Yes. And you tried giving them to management? Several times. Richard looked back at Brandon. Did you fire him because he was wrong? Or because he was right? The room fell silent again. Brandon opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Richard slowly stood, despite his cane. For an 80-year-old man, his voice was surprisingly steady. "I built this company over 40 years. I mortgaged my house. I missed birthdays. I worked Christmas mornings. Not because I wanted money, but because I wanted to build something my family could be proud of." He looked directly at his son. "I gave you the keys, not permission to destroy it. Nobody dared move." Richard turned toward the board. "As majority shareholder, I am requesting an immediate vote." Charles nodded. "On what?" Richard didn't even look at Brandon. "Remove him. Effective immediately." The room exploded into whispers. Brandon slammed his chair backward. "This is ridiculous. You can't do this." Richard answered without raising his voice. "I already did." Brandon looked around desperately, searching for someone, anyone, to support him. No one spoke. One by one, board members raised their hands. 7. Then 8. Then 9. Unanimous. Unanimous. Charles quietly wrote something on the meeting minutes, then looked up. "Brandon Hayes, as of 11:47 this morning, you are no longer Chief Executive Officer of Northridge Industrial Solutions." For the first time since I'd met him, Brandon looked completely lost. He stared at his father. "You chose him over me?" Richard slowly shook his head. "No. I chose the company." Brandon grabbed his jacket and stormed toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned around, his eyes locked onto mine. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Then he walked out. The heavy conference room door slammed shut behind him. None of us knew it yet, but that wasn't the last time I'd see Brandon Hayes. Not even close. 3 months later, he would walk into my office, carrying something I'd never expected. A resume. The room stayed silent long after Brandon left. Nobody celebrated. There were no smiles, only relief. Because everyone understood the same thing. Removing a CEO was only the beginning. Saving the company would be much harder. Richard slowly sat back down. He looked exhausted. Charles slid a glass of water toward him. "Richard, do you want to continue?" Richard nodded. "We don't have time to wait." Daniel opened another folder. The bank's deadline is in 12 days. If we don't present a credible recovery plan, they'll accelerate the loans. One of the directors frowned. "How much debt are we talking about?" Sarah answered. "Just under $87 million. The number hit the room like a brick. One director whispered,
Another rubbed his forehead. So we're fighting the clock. Daniel nodded. And cash. Richard turned toward me. Michael, how many people work here now? About 460. And how many lose their jobs if the company fails? I didn't answer immediately. All of them. He slowly nodded. That's why we're not here to punish people. We're here to save what's left. Then he looked around the table. I want solutions, not speeches.
For the next 6 hours, nobody left the conference room. Whiteboards filled with numbers, supplier lists, debt schedules, customer contracts. It felt less like a board meeting and more like an emergency surgery. Every department was reviewed, every expense questioned, every contract examined. Around 3 in the afternoon, Sarah looked up from her laptop. I think we found our biggest problem. Everyone turned. She projected a chart onto the screen. Our 20 largest customers. Blue bars represented 3 years ago. Orange bars represented today. The difference was shocking. Almost 40% of recurring business had disappeared. Richard looked at me. Why?
I already knew, because Brandon stopped listening. Several people looked confused. I continued. He raised prices, cut customer support, reduced delivery flexibility, and whenever clients complained, he blamed them. One of the sales directors slowly lowered his head. He's right. I lost 3 accounts last year because I wasn't allowed to negotiate. Another manager spoke. So did I. Within minutes, the room filled with similar stories. Nobody had dared challenge Brandon before. Late that evening, Daniel stood in front of the whiteboard. I think we have a recovery plan. He drew 4 circles: cash, customers, operations, trust. We stabilize cash first, then win back customers, then fix operations. And finally, he tapped the last circle. We rebuild trust. Richard smiled for the first time all day. Good. Then he looked directly at me. I have another question. Yes, sir? If this were your company, what would you do first? Every eye in the room turned toward me. I wasn't expecting that. I thought for a moment, then answered honestly. I'd stop pretending. Silence. I'd call every major supplier, tell them exactly what's happening. I'd meet every major customer, admit the mistakes, and I'd bring experienced employees back before hiring a single consultant. Nobody spoke. Richard slowly smiled. Interesting. Why? Because trust comes back faster when people hear the truth. The following morning, Richard called me into his office. His office hadn't changed in years. Old photographs covered one wall. Factory openings, company picnics, Christmas parties, pictures with employees. Not investors, not celebrities, employees. He noticed me looking. I always believed a company isn't machines, it's people. He opened a desk drawer, pulled out a worn leather notebook. I started this business with 3 employees. He placed the notebook in front of me. Know what's inside? I shook my head. The names. Every person who took a chance on me. I opened it carefully. Hundreds of handwritten names, dates, notes, family members, birthdays. Richard laughed softly. My wife used to say I remembered employees better than relatives. He became serious again.
Brandon never understood that. He thought companies exist to serve executives. They don't. They exist because ordinary people show up every morning.
There was a knock on the door. Charles stepped inside. "Sorry to interrupt. The bank representatives are here." Richard nodded. "Let's see if they're willing to give us another chance." The meeting with the bank lasted almost 4 hours. 3 executives, 2 lawyers, 1 restructuring specialist. Nobody smiled. The lead banker adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Hayes, our confidence in this company has been severely damaged." Richard nodded. "I understand." Daniel presented the recovery plan: cash preservation, asset sales, executive restructuring, supplier negotiations, independent financial oversight. The bankers asked dozens of questions. Most were difficult, some impossible. Finally, the lead banker closed his notebook. "We're prepared." The room became completely silent. "To extend the deadline." I quietly exhaled. "Under one condition." Richard looked up. "What condition?" "No member of the previous executive team returns to a management position." Everyone understood exactly who he meant. Brandon. The bank no longer trusted him. At all. Richard didn't hesitate. "You have my word." The banker stood up, then looked directly at me. "Mr. Carter, your financial reports probably saved this company." I didn't know what to say. 3 weeks earlier, those same reports had cost me my job. Now, they had just convinced a bank not to pull $87 million in loans. Life has a strange sense of timing. That evening, as I left the building, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored unknown numbers. For some reason, I answered. A familiar voice spoke. Quiet. Controlled. Almost polite. "Michael." I stopped walking. It was Brandon. "I think we need to talk." I stared at my phone for a few seconds. Part of me wanted to hang up. Another part wanted to know what he could possibly have to say. I answered. "This is Michael." There was a pause. Then Brandon spoke. "I owe you an explanation." I almost laughed. 3 weeks ago would have been... 3 weeks ago would have been a better time. I know. "No, you don't." Silence. Finally, he said, "Can we meet?" I looked back at the Northridge building. Employees were leaving for the day. Some of them had worked there longer than I had. Some were probably wondering if they'd still have jobs next month. I don't think that's a good idea. It concerns the company. So does everything. Please, it's important. After a long pause, I agreed. One condition. Public place, 7 o'clock. A small diner 2 blocks from the office. Brandon was already there when I arrived. No tailored suit, no expensive watch, no company car. Just jeans, a dark jacket, and a cup of coffee that had obviously gone cold. For the first time, he looked like an ordinary man, not a CEO. He stood as I approached. "Thanks for coming." I sat down without shaking his hand. "You've got 10 minutes.
He nodded. Fair enough. The waitress poured fresh coffee. Neither of us touched it.
Finally, Brandon spoke.